Eleanor Marsh pressed her palm flat against the cold stone wall of the east corridor and listened. The Duke's voice was moving through the heavy oak study door, the way thunder moves through ground before a storm reaches the surface. She had heard him shout before. Every person who lived and worked at Havelock Estate had heard him shout, and every person had learned the same thing from it. When Duke Aldrich raised his voice, the wisest place to be was somewhere other than where it was directed. Eleanor had not managed to be somewhere else quickly enough. Sir Edmund Finch, the head steward, had come around the corner while she was still standing in the corridor with a stack of clean linen in her arms. And now he was looking at the wall beside her left ear, with the expression of a man who has already made a decision he does not entirely like, but fully intends to carry through. "The Duke wants to see you," Sir Edmund said. He was addressing the wall, not her face. His study. Now. She set the linen down on the hall table. She smoothed her apron with both hands. She followed him. She had been at Havelock Estate for 3 years. She had come at 16 with a letter of introduction from the church rector in the village where she grew up, and she had been given a position first in the kitchen, and then, as her reliability made itself quietly known, as a housemaid with responsibility for several of the upper rooms. She was 19 now, with steady hands, and the particular kind of patience that develops in people who have learned from early experience that their best qualities go largely unnoticed, while their smallest errors are remembered for a long time. She had never given anyone a serious reason to remember her poorly. She had worked honestly and well, and without complaint, and she had believed, with the simple and unexamined faith of a person who has not yet been given strong reason to believe otherwise, that this was enough. She was about to discover that it was not. The study was behind a door of thick dark oak at the far end of the east wing, and Eleanor had cleaned it every third day for over 2 years. She knew it the way you know a place you have tended faithfully, not just with your eyes but with your hands, your routine, the particular muscle memory of a body that has performed the same tasks in the same space more times than it can count. She knew the fireplace that was almost never lit, because the Duke preferred his rooms cold. She knew the writing desk that sat in the center of the room like something immovable. She knew the stack of papers on the right side of the desk, and the lamp angled to throw light precisely where the Duke wanted it, and the 2 silver candlesticks that stood always on the left side, polished and upright, and entirely where they belonged. They were not there. She saw the empty space the moment she walked through the door, and it stopped her for the smallest fragment of a second, because the absence of a thing that has always been present has a specific weight to it, and she felt that weight before she had time to think about what it meant. Duke Aldrich Havelock sat behind the desk with his hands flat on the surface and his shoulders precisely straight. He was in his early 50s, with close-cut gray hair and a face that had stopped softening at some point in the past decade, and had shown no sign of changing direction since. He was not a large man by the measurement of height or breadth, but he occupied space the way large men do, fully and without apology, and the room around him arranged itself accordingly. He looked at Eleanor when she came in, the way a man looks at a calculation he has already completed and is merely confirming. He did not invite her to sit. He asked her when she had last cleaned the room. She told him, the evening before last, after the dinner service began. She had entered at 7 and left at 7:45. He asked if the candlesticks had been in place when she came in. She said yes. He asked if they were there when she left. She said yes again. Then he told her that Arthur, the footman posted in the corridor outside the study door during the night, had confirmed that no one else had entered the study between Eleanor's departure and this morning. Eleanor heard this very carefully. She knew Arthur Breck. She had worked alongside Arthur for nearly 2 years. Arthur was 22 years old and generally good at his work, with one exception that every person on the estate knew about, which was that he found it very difficult to remain stationary for long periods, and regularly left his post in the east corridor to spend time in the kitchen, where the cook kept warm bread under a cloth near the hearth. Eleanor had herself walked past the corridor on 2 separate evenings, and found the post empty, with the sound of Arthur's footsteps audible on the back staircase heading down. The idea that Arthur had maintained a perfect, unbroken watch outside the study door for an entire night was not a fact that had grown from observation. It was a statement that had been requested from Arthur and given by Arthur, who understood, as all the servants understood, which direction their employment pointed. She also noticed, with the precision of a person paying very close attention under great pressure, that the Duke had not suggested searching the rest of the house. He had not proposed that the candlesticks might have been moved elsewhere by accident or placed somewhere for some other reason. He had traveled, in a perfectly straight and uninterrupted line, from the fact of their absence to her name. There were no pauses, no alternatives considered, no other possibilities left open. This was not how a man behaved when he was trying to find something. This was how a man behaved when he already knew where it was. She said clearly, "I did not take your candlesticks, my lord." He nodded once. "You were the last person known to be in this room." "Yes," she said, "and I left it exactly as I found it." He looked at her for a long moment. She returned the look without wavering. She was 19 years old, and she had nothing to bring into this room except the truth and the willingness to maintain it, and she intended to offer both as clearly and steadily as she could. He told her to remain in her quarters until the matter had been properly addressed, and he said this in the tone of a man telling a door to stay closed. He turned back to his papers. She left. Sir Edmund was waiting close outside the study door. He had been close enough to hear everything, and he looked at Eleanor with an expression that combined genuine sorrow with a complete absence of intention to do anything about it. It was an expression Eleanor had seen before on the faces of people who understand perfectly well that something wrong is happening and have decided, for reasons they find entirely reasonable, that they will not be the person who stops it. "Sir Edmund," she said, "I did not take them." "I believe you, Miss Marsh," he said, very quietly. He walked past her and knocked on the study door. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she collected the stack of linen she had left on the hall table, put it away in the cupboard where it belonged, and went to her room. Bessie Aldro was not there. Bessie would be below stairs until the late afternoon. Eleanor sat on the edge of the narrow bed they shared the room between them, and looked at the gray October sky through the small window above the washstand, and thought very carefully. She was a careful thinker. In a life where power was something that happened above her, she had always relied on thought as the most consistent tool available to her. She applied it now, with the particular focused attention of a person who understands that the stakes are higher than they have ever been. She thought about the two keys to the study. One was on the Duke's person at all times. The other hung in Sir Edmund's key room. Neither had ever been in Eleanor's hands. Her access to the study came always when the room was already open, already available for cleaning, which was how the Duke scheduled it. She thought about Arthur and the account he had given. She thought about the straight line from the candlestick's absence to her name, and the complete absence of any sideways movement toward other explanations. She thought about the Duke's face. She had expected contempt, the flat dismissal that a man of his position directs at people far below his notice. She had seen that, but she had also seen something underneath it, something that she sat with for a long time before she could name it. It had felt like the absence of surprise. He had not been surprised when she walked through that door. He had not been surprised by anything at all. He had been waiting, and she had arrived, and the waiting was over. She sat with this for a long time. When Bessie came in at the end of the afternoon, with food from the kitchen, and a face already tight with worry, Eleanor told her everything. Bessie sat on the stool across from the bed and listened without speaking, which was the most unusual thing about the conversation, because Bessie was warm and generous and always had something to say about everything. The fact that she sat completely still through all of it told Eleanor more about the seriousness of what was happening than anything Sir Edmund had said. When Eleanor finished, Bessie said, "He cannot simply decide on his own. He must follow some kind of procedure. There are rules." "His rules," Eleanor said. "Magistrate Harlow does exactly what the Duke asks him to do. That has always been true." Bessie was quiet for a moment. "I will speak for you," she said. "Every person in this house knows you, Eleanor. Not one of them would believe." "Bessie," Eleanor said it gently, "please do not put yourself in front of this. I need you safe. You are the only person I fully trust in this house. Please stay safe." Bessie reached across the small space between them and took Eleanor's hand and held it. She said nothing more, because there was nothing more to say that would change the shape of what was coming, and Bessie, for all her warmth and quickness, knew this. The October afternoon darkened around them. Below, the house moved into its evening rhythms with the indifferent ease of a large body that keeps moving, regardless of what happens to any of its individual parts. Fires were laid. The dinner service began. Footsteps moved through corridors. Doors opened and closed. The estate continued doing what the estate did, because estates do not stop for the trouble of a housemaid. That evening, Clara Dent knocked softly on the door and, without a word, pressed a small paper of dried lavender into Eleanor's hands and left. Old Ned, the undergardener who had worked the grounds for 20 years and rarely spoke to anyone, left a wrapped piece of cake on the step. Henry Rowe, the stablemaster, sent Arthur down with a flask of warm spiced cider, and Arthur stood at the door with his eyes at the floor, and delivered it without speaking, and went away, carrying with him the full and considerable weight of the account he had given the Duke about the corridor. Eleanor received all of it. She held the lavender. She drank the warm cider. She noted what each of these small things meant, not the things themselves, but the fact of them, the fact that these people had seen what was happening, and, within the small limits of what they could do without losing their own positions, they had done something. It was not nothing. It was not enough, but it was not nothing. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark beside Bessie and thought with the careful, open-eyed honesty she had been practicing her whole life. She thought about the shape of what was happening to her, and about the why of it, the part she did not yet have. She could not understand what a housemaid could have to do with whatever Duke Aldrich Havelock was doing, but she had learned enough from watching powerful people at a careful distance to know that when they moved with this kind of speed and this kind of directness, it was rarely about the thing they said it was about. She was a piece being moved. She just could not yet see the rest of the board. Sir Edmund knocked at 9:30 the next morning. The Duke would address the full household in the great hall at 11. Eleanor's attendance was required. She dressed carefully. She put on her best apron, the white one she saved for occasions that required a certain bearing. She stood at the small mirror above the washstand and looked at herself and said, inwardly, the one thing that needed saying, "You did nothing wrong. Whatever happens in that hall, hold on to that. Everything else can go, but do not let go of that." Bessie came at 11:05 and took her arm without speaking, and they walked down together through the back stairs and the lower corridor and into the great hall, where every person who worked at Havelock Estate was already assembled. The great hall was rarely used for occasions like this. It had high windows along the south wall that let in the pale October light in long strips, and a fireplace burning oak, with the particular smell Eleanor associated with formal days, and the Duke at his most decided. Sir Edmund stood near the fireplace. Arthur stood near the back, and did not look at Eleanor when she walked in. Clara met her eyes for the briefest moment, and looked away with a face that held everything she could not say. Henry Rowe had his arms crossed, and his jaw set, and his gaze fixed on a point on the wall that was not anything real. Duke Aldrich came in through the far door at 11 o'clock precisely. He was dressed formally, as if for a ceremony of some importance, and the formality itself was a statement. Men dress for ceremonies that have already been decided, not for deliberations still in progress. He told the assembled household that 2 silver candlesticks had been removed from his study. He said the investigation had been clear, and its conclusion straightforward. He said Eleanor Marsh, who had been the last person in the study, and whose account could not be reconciled with any other explanation, was responsible. He said she would be confined pending a confirmation from Magistrate Harlow, and that the appropriate correction would take place the following morning at dawn, in the courtyard. Eleanor said, into the quiet of the assembled room, "I did not take them." The room went completely still. "I have never in 3 years of service to this household taken a single thing that was not mine," she said. "I cleaned that room. I left it in the same condition I found it. The candlesticks were there when I left. I want that said clearly, in this room, in front of everyone who works here, because it is the truth, and the truth does not change, because it is inconvenient. I did not take them." The Duke looked at her across the length of the great hall. She looked back. The fire crackled quietly in the enormous fireplace. Not a single other person in the room made a sound. Then the Duke continued, as if she had not spoken. He said what he had come to say, and when he finished, he left, and the room exhaled and began to disperse, and Bessie walked Eleanor back through the corridor and up the stairs, and the sentence hung in the air behind them like smoke. That night was long and dark and entirely quiet. Eleanor lay awake and thought about who she intended to be the following morning, and she thought about it until she knew the answer clearly and had committed to it fully. Then she closed her eyes, and the October darkness held her, and somewhere in the early hours she fell into a sleep that was thin and dreamless and brief. The morning of the punishment arrived the way mornings do in October in England. slowly and without warmth, the gray light coming up before the color, and the cold sitting in the air, like something that had been there all night and had not moved. Eleanor was awake before the light. She had been awake for some time, lying in the quiet and feeling the shape of the day ahead, the way you feel the edges of something in the dark. She did not try to push it away. She had decided very clearly, in the long thinking hours of the night, that she would not spend this morning in denial. She would spend it being exactly who she had told herself she would be. She washed her face in the cold water from the basin. She changed her dress. She combed her hair and pinned it back with the same care she gave to it every morning, because she was not going to give today the satisfaction of making her careless about herself. She had her things. She had what she knew about herself. She held these with both hands. Bessie had not slept either. She sat on the edge of the bed and watched Eleanor dress, with the expression of someone who wants very badly to say something useful, and knows that nothing useful can be said. "You do not have to be brave," she said finally. "Not with me, not right now. You do not have to pretend." "I am not pretending," Eleanor said, pinning her hair. "I decided last night. I know who I am. I am going to be that person today, all the way through." Bessie looked at her for a long moment. Then she got up and stood beside her, and helped with the last pin, and the two of them stood side by side at the small mirror for just a moment, and Eleanor thought, whatever else this morning takes from me, I am still here. I am still exactly myself. No one gets to take that. Sir Edmund knocked at the door at 5:15. Outside the window, the sky was that particular shade of gray that exists in the exact space between night and dawn, not dark enough to be night and not light enough to be morning. He stood in the doorway, and he looked at Eleanor, and for a moment, his face did something she had not seen it do before. It did something very nearly human, something that had nothing to do with his position, or his loyalty to the Duke, or the 30 years of careful professional distance he had built between himself and the things he witnessed in this house. It lasted only a second. Then it was gone. "It is time, Miss Marsh," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know." She reached into the pocket of her dress and took out the small paper of dried lavender that Clara had brought the evening before. She held it for a moment, then she put it in her pocket. She wanted it with her. Bessie took her arm at the door. Sir Edmund moved ahead of them through the corridor without speaking. They walked through the house together, through the back passage and along the lower corridor, past the kitchen door, where Eleanor could already smell the fire being built, and the first sounds of the morning work beginning, past the storeroom, past the heavy back door that opened onto the yard. The October air hit her when the door opened. It was sharp and cold and clean, in the way that early morning air is clean, the whole world washed and still, and carrying that particular silence that belongs to the hour before other people are properly awake. The mist sat above the flagstones of the courtyard in thin, drifting layers. Above the estate wall to the east, the sky was beginning, very slowly, to separate from deep gray into something slightly lighter. The household was already assembled along the far wall of the courtyard. Not every single person, but enough of them, standing in the cold mist with their arms at their sides and their faces held in the particular neutral expression that people wear when they are being required to witness something they would have chosen not to witness. Sir Edmund took his place near the left edge of the assembled group. Arthur was there, near the back, with his eyes on the flagstones. Clara stood with her arms wrapped around herself, and her eyes were already red at the edges. Henry Rowe, the stable master, stood apart from the rest, closer to the stable gate, with his hat in his hands, and his jaw pressed together, and his gaze pointing somewhere far past the courtyard wall. The Duke was at the far end of the courtyard near the entrance to the main house. He was dressed, as he had been in the great hall, in formal clothes, which told Eleanor the same thing it had told her yesterday. This was a ceremony, not an act of necessity or regret. He had prepared for it. He had considered it. He had dressed for it, the way a man dresses for an occasion that he intends to conduct properly. He did not look at Eleanor when she came through the back door. He looked at the space slightly above her, at the mid-distance, which was more of an insult than looking at her would have been, because it meant she was not significant enough even to be looked at directly. Eleanor walked to where Sir Edmund indicated. She stood straight, her hands were still at her sides. She breathed slowly and evenly, the way she had practiced breathing in the long dark hours of the night, and she thought about the morning light beginning to come in over the eastern wall, and about her mother, and about what kind of person she had decided to be. The punishment was carried out by a broad outdoor servant called Foster, who handled the heavy maintenance work of the estate. He did his task without cruelty and without looking at Eleanor's face, which meant he was either a man with a conscience working at its limit, or a man following specific instructions about outcome, and Eleanor could not tell which. She had decided in the night that she would not make a sound. This was not a performance of strength for anyone watching. It was a private decision, a line she had drawn between herself and what was being done to her, something that belonged entirely to her, and could not be taken regardless of what else was. She kept to it. When it was done, she stood straight again, as quickly as her body allowed, because she was not going to let the courtyard see her fall. Sir Edmund was there. He put his hand on her arm briefly, barely a moment, and then removed it, and he looked at the Duke, across the length of the courtyard, with an expression she could not fully read, and then he looked back at her. High above, in the second-floor window of the east wing, a pale shape sat very still against the glass. Lady Catherine Havelock had not left her bedroom in 3 weeks. She was ill in the slow and total way that some illnesses work, taking a little more with each passing month, narrowing the world down room by room until it was this room, this window, this view of the courtyard below. She sat propped against her pillows in the gray morning light and watched what was happening below her, with a face that had gone completely still, the way a face goes still when it has received something it cannot process by ordinary means and has simply stopped trying. She had been watching this man do things she could not stop for 30 years. This was different. This was a thing she had not been able to stop, and the difference this time was that she was going to do something about it. Near the stable gate, in the narrow gap between the heavy wooden gate and the stone of the wall, a boy stood and gripped the wood with both hands and watched. His name was Peter Aldgate, and he was 12 years old, and he had the expression of a person who knows something that could stop what is happening, and has not said it, and is now watching the consequences of that silence unfold in the courtyard below him, and is being changed by it, in a way that does not go away. His knuckles were white on the gate. He had known something for 3 days. 3 days of knowing it and being afraid, and now Eleanor Marsh was standing in the courtyard in the cold mist, and the thing Peter knew sat in his chest like a burning coal, and it would not leave him alone, and it had not left him alone since the night he saw what he saw through the study window, and he was 12 years old, and he did not know what to do about any of it. Eleanor was taken inside by Arthur when it was over. Arthur walked with his eyes fixed on the floor the entire way, through the back door and along the lower corridor, and down the stone steps to the deep level of the house where the root cellar was. The door was unlocked by Sir Edmund, who had come ahead of them, and who opened it without looking at either of them, and Eleanor walked in, and the door was locked behind her. The cellar was cold and dark. The darkness was the particular kind that has no gradations, no lighter and darker areas, just the flat and total absence of light. The smell was of earth and stone, and the faint mineral cold of a space that has not seen sunlight in a long time. There was a wooden bench along the far wall, narrow and low, and on it a folded blanket. There was a bucket of water. There was nothing else. Eleanor sat on the bench. She pulled the blanket around her. She could feel the cold of the stone through the soles of her shoes. She breathed slowly in the dark, and she did the thing she had promised herself she would do, which was to stay exactly who she was, to not let the dark and the cold and the locked door eat anything essential. She reached into her pocket. She found the paper of dried lavender. She held it in her closed fist and felt its small dry weight and the faint warmth it had taken from her hand, and she breathed. In the dark, in the cold, still here, still herself. Above her head, through the floors and the corridors and the rooms of the house, the morning was continuing. She could not see or hear any of it. She could not see the light coming up over the eastern wall, or the mist lifting off the courtyard flagstones, or the household going back to their duties in the particular subdued way of people who have witnessed something they will not talk about directly, but will carry with them for a long time. She could not see Lady Catherine in her window, already calling for Margaret Yates. She could not see Peter at the stable gate, finally letting go of the wood and walking slowly back inside with the expression of a person who has made a decision they cannot unmake. She could not see any of it. But it was happening above her anyway, all of it, moving like water that does not need to be observed to find its direction. The Duke was at breakfast by the time Eleanor sat in the dark cellar with her lavender. He was at his usual place in the dining room, with tea and the morning papers, conducting himself with the precise and unremarkable orderliness that follows from a man who believes he has done what needed to be done and has done it properly. He was satisfied, not in a visible or indulgent way, satisfied in the way of a person who has resolved a difficulty efficiently and can now move on to other things. He did not know about the letter. He did not know yet what had been set in motion 2 floors above him, in the East Wing bedroom, where his wife lay propped against her pillows, with a face like something carved from old stone, asking Margaret Yates to bring paper and a pen and ink. He would not know for several days. And Eleanor, sitting in the dark in the cellar with the blanket around her and the lavender in her hand, did not know either, and so for now, the dark was just the dark, and the cold was just the cold, and she sat in it, and she breathed, and she held herself together, with the same steady hands that had held her together through everything else. She was still herself. They had not taken that, and that was, for this moment, enough. 3 nights before the silver candlesticks were reported missing, a 12-year-old boy named Peter Aldgate could not sleep. This was not unusual for Peter. He was the kind of child who slept lightly and woke often, and the stable was a place of constant small sounds, the shift of horses in the straw, the creak of the old timber walls when the wind moved against them, the particular rustling of animals that are not quite settled and not quite awake. He had grown up with these sounds since the age of 8, when Henry Rowe had taken him on as a stable boy, and he generally found them more comforting than not. But tonight, the gray foal in the far stall was sick. She had been off her feed since the afternoon, and when Peter had checked on her before he slept, she had been standing with her head low and her breathing shallow. And it was the kind of quiet illness in a young horse that can go either way overnight. And Peter had known enough about horses by this point in his life to know that you did not leave a sick foal alone without checking on her in the night. He got up at midnight. He pulled on his coat and his boots, and he took the small lantern from its hook and went down the length of the stable to the far stall where the gray foal stood. She was worse. Not dramatically, not in the way that meant immediate crisis, but worse, in the quiet, steady way of a creature whose body is working very hard at something. He stayed with her for a while, speaking to her in the low voice he used with horses, checking her breathing and her eyes, eventually deciding she was stable enough for now, but needed checking again in another few hours. He stood up to go back to his straw bed at the end of the stable, and that was when he saw the light. It was in the window of the study, on the east side of the house. The study window faced the stable yard, and at midnight the house was entirely dark, except for this one light, which meant someone was awake in the Duke's study, at an hour when no one should be awake in the Duke's study. Peter stood in the yard with his lantern and looked at the light. He should have gone back to his bed. He was 12 years old, and it was midnight, and the cold was sharp, and the right thing to do was to go back inside and get a few hours of sleep before the foal needed checking again. This was the sensible thing. This was the thing any reasonable person would have done. He did not do it. He could not have told you precisely why. Curiosity was part of it, because he was 12, and curiosity is a powerful force at 12, and a light in a dark window at midnight is exactly the kind of thing that pulls at a curious 12-year-old. But there was also something else, something he could not have named at the time, but would understand later, something in the quality of that light, the specific way it sat in the window, that was not quite right, not the casual lamplight of someone who had come to the study for a perfectly ordinary reason. Too deliberate, too still. He crossed the yard. He moved carefully, keeping to the edge where the shadow was deepest, not because he was trying to be sneaky, but because some instinct told him to be quiet about this. He reached the wall below the study window. The window was high, but there was a stone mounting block used for horses near the wall, and he climbed up on it and looked through the lower corner of the glass. Duke Aldrich Havelock was standing at the left side of his writing desk. He was fully dressed, despite the midnight hour, which was odd. He was holding the 2 silver candlesticks, one in each hand, and he was looking at them, with the specific expression of a person checking that a plan is unfolding correctly. He set them on the desk. He took a cloth from his coat pocket, the kind of cloth used in the stables for wrapping things, heavy and dark, and he wrapped the candlesticks in it carefully, methodically, the way you wrap something you intend to transport. He tied the cloth. He picked up the bundle. Then he crossed to the study door and opened it. He looked up and down the corridor. Peter could not see the corridor from where he stood, but he could see the Duke's face when he looked out, and the face was a man checking that no one was there. Then the Duke went out, pulling the door closed behind him, and the lamp in the study burned on alone above the empty desk. Peter stayed on the mounting block for a long moment. He was not entirely sure what he had just seen. He was 12 years old, and he knew who the Duke was, and what the Duke was, and the idea that the Duke of Havelock Estate would take something from his own study in the middle of the night and carry it out wrapped in a tablecloth was a thing so far outside Peter's understanding of how the world worked that he needed some time to simply hold it before he could begin to think about what it meant. He climbed down from the mounting block. He stood in the cold yard and he thought, he was not a stupid boy. He was actually a quite perceptive boy, which is why Henry Rowe kept him on, because horses respond to perception in the people around them, and a perceptive stable hand is worth 2 unperceptive ones. He thought about what he had seen, and he turned it over and looked at it from different sides, and what it came out to was this. The Duke of the estate had, in the middle of the night, removed his own silver candlesticks from his own study, and taken them somewhere else, in his own house, wrapped in a cloth that belonged in the stable. And he had done this while looking out the door first, to make sure no one could see him. People did not look outdoors to check that no one was watching when they were doing ordinary things. Peter went back to the stable. He checked on the foal, who was standing a little better, breathing a little easier. He lay down on his straw bed and stared at the roof of the stable in the dark and thought for a long time. He did not sleep again that night. In the morning, the foal was improved, and Peter went about his work as usual. He said nothing to Henry Rowe. He said nothing to anyone. He told himself that he had perhaps misunderstood what he saw. He told himself that the Duke certainly had reasons of his own for whatever he was doing with his own belongings in his own house, and that it was none of Peter's business, and that a 12-year-old stable boy did not go around discussing the nighttime activities of dukes. He worked through the morning and the afternoon and the evening, and went to his straw bed and told himself he had forgotten about it, and lay awake for a long time, not forgetting about it at all. The next morning, Eleanor Marsh was accused. Peter heard about it the way all the servants heard about it, through the particular network of whisper and implication that moves information through a large household faster than any formal announcement could manage. He was cleaning tack in the yard when Clara Dent came out from the kitchen door, with the look on her face that meant something serious had happened, and she told him what the Duke had said and what Eleanor was accused of, and Peter stood with the bridle in his hands and felt the blood leave his face. He knew Eleanor. Not well, not in the way you know the people you spend most of your time with, but well enough. She brought water to the stable sometimes in hot weather, and she had stopped to look at the foals in the spring, and she had the sort of face that you can read at a glance, the sort of face that has no hiding in it, the face of a person who is entirely what she appears to be. He looked at Clara telling him about the accusation, and he thought, she did not take them. He knew with complete certainty that she had not taken them, because he had seen who had, and he said nothing. He told himself it was because he was afraid, and this was true. He was 12 years old, and the person he had seen through that window was the Duke of the estate, the man who owned every building Peter slept in and worked in, and every piece of ground Peter walked on, the man on whose goodwill Peter's entire existence here depended, the man whose reaction to a 12-year-old stable boy making accusations against him Peter could not begin to imagine with any comfort. He was afraid, and this was the truth, but there was more to it than the fear. There was also a thing he could not name, a kind of paralysis that comes when a person knows what the right thing to do is, and knows the cost of doing it, and cannot yet find the mechanism that moves them from knowing to acting. He was frozen between the two. He could see Eleanor's situation clearly, and he could see his own situation clearly, and he could see what the right thing was, and he stood frozen between them, and the days began to pass. Lord Weston Crane, meanwhile, was in the guest wing of the estate, entirely unaware of what had been placed in his room while he slept. He was the Duke's cousin on his father's side, a man of 45, who had inherited a modest property in the next county, and who had come to Havelock Estate, at what he understood to be his cousin's invitation, to discuss a long-standing dispute about a parcel of land near the river. He was not a man who looked for trouble. He was, in fact, a man who spent considerable energy trying to avoid it, which was part of why the land dispute had dragged on for as many years as it had, because Lord Weston consistently retreated from confrontation, even when confrontation might have resolved things faster. He was polite and somewhat careful, and had a habit of reading in the evenings by his own lamp and retiring early. He had no idea that the cloth-wrapped silver candlesticks had been placed in the wardrobe of his guest room in the small hours of a Tuesday morning, arranged to look as if they had been tucked there by a person trying to hide them quickly in a panicked moment. He had no idea that this had been done deliberately, that it was part of a sequence of events designed to result in a specific outcome that he would not see coming until it was too late to stop. He ate his breakfast in the guest wing dining room on the morning Eleanor was taken before the Duke's study and accused, and he read the newspaper he had requested from the outside courier, and he had tea, and he was perfectly and completely innocent of everything, and he did not know any of it. Peter knew. Peter stood in the stable yard and knew, and said nothing, and the knowledge sat inside him, getting heavier with every hour that passed, like something that is growing in the dark, like something that is going to eventually require more space than is available and will have to come out one way or another. He watched Eleanor in the courtyard that morning. He watched from the gap at the stable gate, gripping the wood until his hands ached, watching what was happening, because he could not look away from it, even though looking at it was the worst thing he had experienced in his short life. He stood and watched, and the burning coal of what he knew sat in his chest, and he breathed through it, and he did not speak. But something changed in him that morning in the courtyard. It did not resolve itself into action yet. He was not yet at the point where the knowing became moving. But something broke loose in him while he watched, something that had been frozen, and the thing that broke loose began, slowly and painfully, to move. He went back to the stable. He tended the gray foal, who was fully recovered now, and eating well, and entirely indifferent to anything happening outside the stable. He worked through the morning and into the afternoon. He said nothing to Henry Rowe, who was himself, saying nothing to anyone, but whose silence had a different quality than it usually did. A weight to it, a deliberate turned-away quality, the silence of a man who has seen something he will carry. Peter did his work, and he carried his knowledge, and he breathed through the burning of it, and he thought about Eleanor in the cellar below the house, and about the fact that the truth was sitting right here in his chest, and doing absolutely nothing while she sat in the dark below. He did not yet know what he was going to do, but he was, for the first time since the night at the study window, beginning to ask himself what would happen if he told someone, beginning to ask it seriously, beginning to think past the immediate fear toward the question of what came next if someone believed him, beginning, in the slow and terrifying way of a person approaching something enormous, to consider it as a real possibility rather than an impossible one. He lay in his straw bed that night and stared at the stable roof and thought about Eleanor, and thought about what he had seen through the window, and thought about what it meant to know a thing and say nothing, and what kind of person that made you, and whether the person it made you was one you could live with. He was 12 years old, and he was trying to answer a question that would have been difficult for anyone twice his age, but he was thinking about it. He was turning it over, in the dark, in the quiet of the stable, with the sound of the horses around him, and the gray foal breathing easily in her stall at the end. He did not sleep well. Lady Catherine Havelock had been watching her husband for 30 years. She had learned to read him the way you learn to read the weather, in a country where the weather changes often, and the changes matter, not with certainty, never with certainty, but with enough accumulated knowledge to recognize a pattern when it began. She had recognized this one. She lay in her bed in the East Wing room, propped against the pillows that Margaret Yates arranged each morning, with the careful, practical tenderness of a woman who has spent a long time keeping another woman comfortable in circumstances that required a great deal of tenderness to survive. The room was warm. The fire was well kept. Outside the window, the October garden was still and gray, the last of the leaves in the old oak tree along the wall turning at the edges, going amber at the tips in the cold air. Lady Catherine had been watching that tree for 30 years too. She knew it the way she knew the estate, the way you know something when you have watched it through every season, until the seasons stop surprising you. She was 50 years old. The illness had been with her for 2 years now, not dramatically, not in a way that could be pointed to as a crisis, but steadily, taking a little more each month, making the rooms smaller, making the stairs impossible, and then the corridor difficult, and then finally this room, this window, this view, this fixed and narrowing world. Her doctor, who came from the town once a fortnight, spoke to her in the careful optimistic language that doctors use when they are not optimistic, and she listened to him with the patience of someone who has decided to use their remaining energy on something more important than arguing about prognosis. She had decided, watching from this window, to use her remaining energy on this. She had watched Eleanor Marsh in the courtyard that morning. She had seen the household assembled in the cold mist. She had seen Sir Edmund with his hands behind his back and his face arranged into something that was not quite looking at the proceedings. She had seen the Duke at the far end in his formal clothes, and she had seen Eleanor, who had stood straight and still with her hands at her sides, and her face set in an expression of such deliberate, private composure that it had gone through Lady Catherine like something sharp. She knew Eleanor, not in the way that employers of the time typically knew their servants, not merely as a function and a name and a record of duties performed. She had noticed Eleanor specifically, over the 3 years of her service, because the girl had a quality about her that was difficult to put into words, but easy to recognize. A quality of complete authenticity. The quality of a person who is entirely what they appear to be, who has no gap between their face and what is behind it. In a household full of people who had learned various degrees of performance, Eleanor had always struck Lady Catherine as someone who simply did not know how to be anything other than exactly herself. People like that did not steal. Lady Catherine had spent 30 years watching her husband move things to suit himself. She had watched him arrange situations, manage people, shift the landscape of the estate to produce the outcomes he wanted, without anyone being able to point to the mechanism clearly enough to object to it. She had seen employees dismissed for things that had been done by others. She had seen accounts altered. She had seen a great many things, and she had been, for 30 years, unable to do much about any of them, because the mechanisms available to a woman in her position were limited, and because she had been, for most of those years, either unwilling or unable to commit to the cost of using them. She was willing now. The illness had stripped away a great deal, but one of the things it had stripped away was the particular fear that keeps people from acting when they have been watching something wrong for a long time. When you have already lost most of what can be taken, the calculation changes. She called for Margaret. Margaret Yates had been with Lady Catherine for 11 years. She was 42 years old, quiet and capable, and possessed of the specific quality of intelligence that knows when to speak and when not to, which is one of the rarest and most useful forms of intelligence there is. She came into the room when called and looked at Lady Catherine's face, and she understood from what she saw there that this was not a routine request. "I need to write a letter," Lady Catherine said. "An important letter. I need your help with it, because my hand is not steady enough for what it needs to be." Margaret sat in the chair beside the bed and took out the small writing case she always carried. She uncapped the ink. She set the paper on the board across her knees. She looked at Lady Catherine and waited. Lady Catherine gathered her thoughts for a moment. She had been composing this letter in her mind for most of the morning, since before the courtyard, really, since before Eleanor was brought down, since the beginning of all of this, the days when she had watched her husband set something in motion and had felt the familiar dread of understanding what was coming without having any way to stop it. She began. She addressed the letter to the Privy Council in London, to whichever member of the council's office dealt with matters of noble misconduct and the abuse of estate authority. She gave her full name and title. She stated that she was writing from Havelock Estate in Devonshire, and that she was ill, and that this letter might be one of the last formal communications she was able to make, which was not a bid for sympathy, but a statement of fact, relevant to understanding why she had not acted sooner, and was acting now. She described, then, as clearly and in as much detail as her knowledge allowed, what she believed had occurred. She described the arrival of Lord Weston Crane at the estate, and the nature of the land dispute. She described the manner in which the silver candlesticks had been used as a pretext, the accusation against Eleanor Marsh, and the punishment that had been carried out that morning in the courtyard. She described what she had observed from her window over the preceding days, the nature of her husband's behavior, the speed and directness with which he had moved from the disappearance of the candlesticks to the accusation, the formal proceeding with Magistrate Harlow that she knew was coming. She said, "There is a young woman of 19 years confined in the cellar of this estate for a thing she did not do." She said, "There is a scheme being carried out that will result in the unjust removal of another man's property." She said, "I have watched this household for 30 years, and I know the difference between justice and arrangement, and this is arrangement." She signed the letter with her full name and her title. Her hand was shaking, but Margaret steadied the paper, and the signature was clear. Margaret read the letter back to her when it was finished. Lady Catherine listened to it carefully, and changed 2 words, and confirmed the rest. Then, she folded it, and sealed it. "I need you to take this to the postal courier in the village," she said. "Today. This afternoon. Not through the estate post, not through any of the estate channels, directly to the village courier, who posts for the London route. Can you do this?" Margaret looked at her. "Yes," she said, "I can do this. You understand what I am asking of you." "I understand. If anyone asks where you have been to the apothecary for my medicine. You often go for this reason. It will not seem unusual." "I know," Margaret said. She looked at the letter in her hands for a moment. Then she put it inside her coat, close to her chest, and stood up. "I will go now," she said, "before the light goes." Lady Catherine watched her leave. The room was quiet after she went. The fire clicked and shifted. The old oak tree outside the window held its last amber leaves in the gray afternoon air. She lay back against the pillows and felt the effort of the morning in her bones, which these days was where she felt everything, not in her muscles but in the deep places, the structural places, the places that let you know when the body has reached the edge of what it can comfortably do. She had reached that edge. She was a little past it. She was not sorry. She thought about Eleanor in the cellar, and about the letter now moving through the estate in Margaret's coat, and about what it would set in motion if it reached the right hands. She knew enough about how these things worked to know that it might reach no one useful, that it might be set aside by a clerk who did not consider it significant enough to pass upward, that it might take weeks or arrive too late. She knew this. But she also knew that doing nothing was a certainty, and that doing something was at least a chance. And she had decided some years ago, in one of the long, quiet thinking hours that illness provides in abundance, that chances were worth taking, when the alternative was to be the person who saw something and said nothing. She had been that person for 30 years. She was not going to be that person for what remained. Margaret did not return until after dark. She came back to the room quietly and stood at the door and said, "It is done. The courier leaves for London, on the first coach in the morning." Lady Catherine nodded once. "Good," she said. "Now come sit with me. I am tired, and I do not want to be alone." Margaret came and sat in the chair beside the bed, and Lady Catherine looked at the window, where the oak tree was now invisible in the dark, and she breathed slowly, and felt the particular quality of having done the only thing you could do, and not knowing yet whether it would be enough. The uncertainty was not comfortable, but it was the only honest place to be, and she had decided to be honest, and so she sat with it, in the quiet dark room, and let Margaret be there beside her, and waited for morning. Outside, the letter was in the hands of the village courier, waiting in his leather satchel, for the first coach. Below the house, Eleanor was in the cellar, in the dark, with her blanket and her lavender. In the guest wing, Lord Weston Crane was reading by his lamp, entirely unaware. In the stable, Peter Aldgate was lying on his straw bed, staring at the roof. The estate was quiet. The estate was always quiet at this hour. But something had changed in it today. Something that had not existed in the morning existed now. It was small, and it was uncertain, and it was moving toward London, in a sealed letter, at the bottom of a courier's satchel. And whether it would be enough or not, it was there, and it had not been there before, and that was not nothing. Lady Catherine thought, it might be enough. She held this thought the way you hold something fragile and precious in the dark, carefully, without gripping too hard, staying still, waiting for the light to come back so you can see clearly. It might be enough. Time moves differently in the dark. Eleanor had not known this before. She had experienced darkness, of course. Everyone has. The ordinary dark of nights and closed rooms, and the low-light hours before dawn. But this was different from all of that in ways she had not expected. This dark was total, and it was constant, and it had no end that she could see, no lightening at the edges to mark the turning of the hours. She could not tell when day became night, or when night became day. She could not tell how many hours she had slept, or whether she had slept at all, or whether what felt like sleep was simply the body shutting down briefly, to protect itself from the ongoing strain of darkness and cold. She had to find other ways to measure time. She listened for sounds. The cellar was deep in the house, but not so deep that everything was silenced. In the early morning, she could hear, very faintly, the sounds of the kitchen above her, and the movement of people beginning the day's work. and the particular sounds that wood and stone make when a building is warming from its nighttime cold. She learned to use these sounds as a clock. The kitchen beginning was morning. The particular quality of deep quiet above her was night. The middle hours were harder to read, but she managed. Bessie came on the first evening. Eleanor heard the footsteps on the stone steps before she heard the key in the lock, and she had the blanket pulled around her on the bench, and was sitting very still, because she had not yet learned to tell who was coming down the steps, and her first reflex was to be as small and unreadable as possible, until she knew. But it was Bessie. The door opened, and the light of a small candle came in before Bessie did, and the candle was the most beautiful thing Eleanor had seen, in longer than made complete sense, given how many days it had been. She closed her eyes for a moment against the brightness of it, because her eyes had become very sensitive in the dark, and even a small candle was a great deal to them now. Bessie came in quickly, and set the candle down, and put her arms around Eleanor, and Eleanor let herself be held for a moment, which was a thing she had not allowed herself yet in the cellar, where being held by anyone was not available, and the sudden warmth of another person was almost too much. "You are all right," Bessie said. She was saying it as a statement rather than a question, which Eleanor understood was Bessie's way of insisting on it. "I am all right," Eleanor said. Bessie pulled back and looked at her in the candlelight, with the specific expression of someone examining a thing they care about very much for damage, going systematically through all the visible parts. She had brought food in a cloth, bread, a piece of cold chicken, an apple, and a small jar of something warm that turned out to be soup, which Bessie must have kept close to her body under her coat to preserve its warmth on the way down, and which arrived at Eleanor not hot, but warm enough that it mattered. Eleanor ate while Bessie sat on the bench beside her and talked quietly about the estate, about the day, about the things that had happened above Eleanor's head while Eleanor was below. She talked the way a person talks when they are trying to fill a silence that has had too much empty dark in it, not babbling, not nervous, just steady and warm and continuous, the way a fire is. Henry Rowe, Bessie said, had refused to speak to the Duke directly at breakfast, had looked through him in a way that was noticed by everyone. Sir Edmund had been very quiet and had been seen sitting alone in the key room for an unusual length of time. Clara had cried twice in the kitchen, and then apologized for it, which the cook had told her not to do, because the cook had her own feelings about the matter and had no interest in pretending otherwise. "What about Arthur?" Eleanor asked. Bessie was quiet for a moment. "Arthur is not managing well," she said finally. "He knows what he did. He has known since the moment he said it, I think. He is the kind of person who agreed to something because he was asked by someone he could not refuse, and who then has to live inside that decision, and it is not sitting easily." Eleanor thought about this. She did not hate Arthur. She understood Arthur. Arthur was a 22-year-old employed man who had been asked by his employer to confirm a thing, and had confirmed it, because the alternative was a confrontation with the person who controlled his livelihood, and that was a confrontation he did not have the internal resources to have. She understood it. Understanding it did not make it easier to sit in the dark, but it made it something she could hold without too much bitterness, and she preferred to hold things without bitterness when she could, because bitterness was a heavy thing to carry, and the cellar was already heavy enough. Bessie came every evening. Eleanor began to count the days by Bessie's visits, 1 visit per day, which gave her a structure to put around the formless dark hours. Between visits, she occupied herself as methodically as she could. She walked the length of the cellar from wall to wall, 10 paces, to keep her body moving and her blood circulating in the cold. She sat on the bench and thought through things she knew, recited things in her mind, verses she had memorized as a child, the names of the plants in her mother's garden, the names of the stars her father had taught her before he became ill, the sequence of tasks in a properly run household from first morning until last lamp. She built structures out of knowledge in the dark because structures kept the dark from being just dark. She thought about the why. She had been thinking about it since the beginning, since the study, since the moment she noticed that the Duke's line from the candlesticks to her name had no turns in it. She had enough pieces now to see the shape of something, though not all of it. Lord Weston Crane was staying in the guest wing. Lord Weston and the Duke had some kind of dispute. The candlesticks were valuable. She had been the pretext for something, and the something was connected to Lord Weston, and the connection was the candlesticks. The pieces pointed in that direction, but she did not have the why of her own involvement. The specific reason she had been the chosen pretext, and she sat with that gap honestly, knowing that some things you do not get to know from the inside of a locked cellar. Clara Dent came once, on the third day, while Bessie was not there. Eleanor heard the steps and held still, and the door opened, and it was Clara with a small covered dish of something warm, and a candle stub that was lit, and she set both things down just inside the door, and looked at Eleanor, with red eyes, and could not seem to make words work, and then she left. Eleanor ate what Clara had brought, and held the candle stub until it burned down to nothing, and sat in the brief warm flickering light of it, and thought about the gift of small kindnesses, from people who do not have much to give. Henry Rowe never came himself, but Bessie reported that he had begun doing something he had not done before, which was leaving the stable gate nearest the cellar stairs unlocked when he was working in the yard, in a way that was technically against estate rules, and that no one on the estate was acknowledging or addressing, because everyone understood what it meant and respected him for it, even though it was unlikely to change anything practical about Eleanor's situation. Peter Aldgate said nothing. Bessie mentioned him only once, in passing, saying that the stable boy had been very quiet lately, that Henry had commented on it, that Peter had been doing his work without speaking to anyone, and spending his evenings in the stable with the animals, rather than coming to the kitchen in the evenings as he sometimes did. Eleanor listened to this and thought about a 12-year-old child alone, in a stable, with something on his mind, and she felt something for him that was not quite understanding and not quite sympathy, but was in the vicinity of both. She did not know what Peter knew. She did not know about the window, or the midnight walk across the yard, or the wrapped bundle the Duke had carried out of the study. But she knew, from Bessie's careful description of his silence and his turned inward quality, that something was sitting on the boy. She thought about what that something might be, and she filed the thought away. The cellar's cold was a constant. She had adjusted to it, the way the body adjusts to a sustained temperature, not comfortably, but with the resignation of something that cannot be changed. She wore the blanket around her shoulders for most of the day. She kept moving when she could, and sat still when she needed to rest. She slept in the blanket on the bench, and the sleep was thin, and frequently interrupted, but it was something. On the fourth day, she had a moment of genuine difficulty. It came without warning in what she believed was the afternoon, in the period of relative silence above her that fell between the midday work and the evening preparations. She was sitting on the bench, and she had been thinking about her mother for a long time, thinking about the particular quality of her mother's voice, and the smell of the cottage where she had grown up, and the sound of the river in spring, and the thinking had gone on long enough that it had moved from comfort into something else, into the specific pain of realizing how far away all of it was, and how small the distance between that world and this dark cellar was in actual miles, and how enormous it was in every other way. She sat with it. She let it be what it was. She did not push it down or reason around it. She breathed through it, slowly and carefully, the way she had breathed through other things. She was still here. The cellar could hold her body, but it could not hold her mind, and her mind was still free to go where she sent it, and she was going to make sure she kept sending it somewhere worth going. After a while, the pain settled into something more manageable, not gone, just manageable. She reached into her pocket and felt the lavender. It was dry and papery and small, and it was still there, still hers, still warm from her pocket. She held it and breathed, and reminded herself what she had decided on the morning they brought her here. She was still exactly who she was. The cellar could not take that. No one could take that. It was the one thing in her possession that was genuinely beyond reach. She was still here. Above her, in the rooms she could not see, the estate was continuing. The Duke was at his desk, writing letters, signing papers, being what he was. In the guest wing, Lord Weston Crane was growing increasingly uneasy about a conversation he had had with the Duke 2 days ago. A conversation about the silver and certain documents. A conversation that had left him with the cold, specific feeling of a man who has just realized that the ground he was standing on is less solid than it appeared. In the East Wing, Lady Catherine was lying in her bed watching the oak tree and waiting, counting the days since the letter had left in Margaret's coat, doing the arithmetic of distance and routes and whether it could possibly have arrived yet. And somewhere on the roads between Devonshire and London, or perhaps already in London, depending on when it had arrived and how quickly it had been read, A letter in a sealed envelope was beginning to work its way through the layers of official hands that stood between a dying woman's words and the person who could do something about them. Eleanor did not know any of this. She sat in the dark with her lavender and her blanket and her careful, faithful inventory of who she was, and she waited. Magistrate George Harlow arrived at Havelock Estate on the afternoon of the third day after the punishment, coming up the drive in his covered carriage, with the unhurried manner of a man performing a routine duty. He was 60 years old, with a large face and small eyes, and the particular bearing of a man who has held a position of official authority for long enough that the authority has become his primary characteristic, the thing you see when you look at him before you see anything else. He had known Duke Aldrich for 22 years. The relationship between them was one of the relationships that does not have a clean name. Not friendship exactly, not quite employer and employee, but something that had elements of both and was held together primarily by the accumulated weight of favors exchanged and obligations maintained over more than 2 decades. The Duke had supported Harlow's appointment. The Duke had, on 3 specific occasions that Harlow could name, and several more that he preferred not to, intervened in circumstances that would otherwise have been awkward for Harlow's professional position. In exchange, Harlow had, over the years, signed certain documents, confirmed certain accounts, and produced certain findings that aligned with the Duke's preferred version of events. It was not a comfortable arrangement, seen in clear light, but Harlow was a man who had become skilled at managing the angle at which he held things, so that the clear light did not often reach them. He was received in the study. The Duke was already seated when Harlow came in. He did not stand. He indicated the chair across the desk with a brief gesture, and waited for Harlow to sit and settle himself, and then he explained what was required. He explained it concisely and without apparent discomfort. He needed Harlow's formal confirmation of the judgment regarding the housemaid, a written finding, properly signed and dated, establishing the charge and the outcome as matters of official record. This was straightforward enough, the kind of thing Harlow had done before, and the Duke presented it as such. Then he explained the second part. The second part was that certain evidence had been discovered in the guest room of Lord Weston Crane, evidence that implicated Lord Weston in the theft of property from the estate. The Duke wished this to be formally documented as well, and he wished for the legal implications of such a finding to be clearly established with regard to a certain parcel of disputed land whose ownership had been the subject of ongoing correspondence between himself and Lord Weston for the past 3 years. Harlow listened to all of this without changing his expression. He was good at not changing his expression. He had developed this skill over many years as a professional requirement, the ability to receive information of any nature with the same steady, slightly blank attention, so that nothing could be read in his face until he was ready to have it read. When the Duke finished, Harlow sat quietly for a moment. He was doing, behind the unchanged expression, what he always did in these moments, a very rapid and thorough calculation of costs and possibilities. He was weighing what the Duke was asking against what the Duke was not asking, and he was weighing his own position against the positions of everyone else in the room, and he was adding up the total with the particular efficiency of a man who has done this calculation many times. What the Duke was asking was this: confirm that the housemaid took the silver, and confirm that Lord Weston was found with the silver, and confirm the legal implications for the land. What this would do: remove Lord Weston's claim to the land on the grounds of his criminal conduct at the estate, which was precisely the outcome the Duke needed and had been working toward for 3 years, through more conventional means without success. What it would require of Harlow: sign his name to a finding he knew was constructed rather than discovered, plant his official authority on top of a lie, and make it look like a fact. He had done things in the vicinity of this before. He had done things he did not like, and signed things he was not comfortable with. But he sat in that chair and looked at what the Duke was asking him to do this time, and he felt, more acutely than he usually felt it, the distance between where he was and where he should be. He also calculated, with equal acuity, what it would mean to refuse. He was 60 years old. His position, his house, his income, his professional standing, his good name in the county, all of it existed within a structure that the Duke could dismantle if he chose to. He had documents in his possession that the Duke had given him, and he had known from the moment he received them that they were simultaneously gifts and chains, and that the chain was the more important part. He could not afford to refuse. He said, I will need to speak with Lord Weston before I can formally document his involvement. That can be arranged, the Duke said. And the silver must be examined in situ before I record its discovery. It is still in the guest room, the Duke said. Nothing has been moved. Harlow nodded once. He had bought himself a small amount of procedure, a small amount of official form to wrap around the thing he was going to do, enough to tell himself later that he had followed the correct process. It was not much. He knew it was not much. But it was what was available to him, and he took it. He spent the afternoon in the guest wing. He looked at the cloth-wrapped silver in the wardrobe of Lord Weston's room, with the particular expression of a man observing something that has been placed exactly where it is most useful to find it. He noted its presence. He noted the wrapping. He said nothing about what the wrapping told him, which was that no person hiding stolen silver in a room would wrap it in a cloth that smelled of hay and horses before doing so, because why would they, unless they had access to a stable, which Lord Weston did not, having ridden to the estate by coach, and having had no occasion to enter the stable at any point during his visit. He noted none of this. He spoke briefly with Lord Weston, who was called from his sitting room by Sir Edmund, and who came with the complete and visible bewilderment of a person who genuinely does not understand what they are being asked to explain. Lord Weston's face, when he looked at the silver in his wardrobe, was not the face of a man caught. It was the face of a man who is looking at something that should not be there, and is trying very hard to understand how it got there. Harlow recognized this face. He had seen many faces in his career, and this was not the face of guilt. He noted none of this either. He went back to the study and sat across from the Duke and signed the documents that William Dobbs, the Duke's solicitor, had already prepared and brought to the estate 2 days ago, when the Duke had been very certain of Harlow's compliance. The documents were thorough, clear, and entirely constructed, and Harlow signed each page carefully and in full, and as he did so, he felt the chain that the Duke had always held tightened by another link, and he told himself that this was the last time, as he had told himself the last several times, and he knew that it was not. Lord Weston was told the findings by Sir Edmund that evening. He was told with the formal neutrality of someone delivering information they have been instructed to deliver without editorial comment. Lord Weston stood in the corridor outside his sitting room and listened, and his face went through several expressions in rapid succession, before settling on the one that had nothing to do with guilt or anger or calculation, but was simply the look of a man confronting something he does not know how to defend against, because he has never in his life done the thing he is being told he did, and he does not know how to prove this to anyone. He said, very quietly, "I did not take anything from this house." Sir Edmund said, "The magistrate has made his finding, my lord." "The magistrate is wrong, my lord." Lord Weston went back into his sitting room. He sat in the chair beside the window, and he looked out at the October garden, and his hands were very still in his lap, and he tried to think clearly about what was happening and what he could do about it, and the answer to both of these questions was not encouraging. The Duke was in his dining room that evening, eating dinner alone as he often did, with the pleasant and unremarkable appetite of a man who has had a productive day. The documents were signed, the land matter was moving toward resolution, the housemaid had been addressed, the matter of his cousin had been handled. He ate well and he drank well, and he sat afterward by the fire in his private sitting room with a glass of port, and felt the specific satisfaction of a man who has arranged things and has the wit to appreciate the arrangement. He did not know about the letter. It was not a thing he had considered. Lady Catherine's involvement in the events of the estate had been, for some years, a theoretical possibility rather than a practical one. She was ill. She barely left her room. She had no mechanism for acting on anything she observed, or so he had assumed, because he had made the error that powerful people often make, which is to underestimate the range of action available to a person they have written off as limited. He did not know that 5 days ago, a letter had left this estate in the coat of a lady's maid, and had gone to the village postal courier, and from there to the London coach, and that the London coach had delivered it to the Privy Council offices 3 days later, and that a clerk in those offices had read it, and that the clerk had taken it to his superior, and that the superior had read it with great care, and recognized in it the signature of a woman of title and standing, and that this recognition had put the letter on a different trajectory than most of the letters that arrived in those offices. He did not know any of this. He drank his port by the fire, and believed himself to be, as he had always believed himself to be, entirely in command of the situation. In the cellar below him, Eleanor sat in the dark with her blanket and her lavender, and counted Bessie's visits to keep track of the days. She did not know about the letter either. She sat in the dark and thought and breathed, and held herself together with the specific and steady determination of a person who has decided that they are not going to be broken by this. 5 days had passed since the letter left. The roads between London and Devonshire were good in October, dry and firm, the autumn rains not yet begun in earnest. A man on a good horse could make the journey in a long day, riding hard, changing horses at the posting inns along the route. A man with a royal writ and a direct order, and no reason to dawdle, could make it in less. Captain Roland Gray had received his orders that morning. Captain Roland Gray worked from a room on the 3rd floor of the Privy Council offices in London, a room that had the particular quality of rooms occupied by people who do their work methodically and have no interest in the appearance of their workspace beyond what the work requires. There was a desk. There were shelves of filed correspondence, organized by county and date. There was a map of England on the wall with routes marked in faded ink, and a second map beside it of the western counties. There was a chair, and a second chair for the people who came to sit across from him. He was 41 years old. He had been a soldier before he was what he was now, 12 years in service in the army, including time in postings that had taught him things about human behavior under pressure that 12 years in a comfortable office would not have taught him. He had the kind of build that comes from years of physical discipline, followed by years of not entirely abandoning it, not large, but solid, with the economy of movement that belongs to people who have learned not to waste anything. His face was the face of a person who listens more than he speaks, and who, when he does speak, tends to say what he means, without spending much time on the decorative parts. He had been with the King's Investigation Office for 6 years. His work was the investigation of claims made against persons of rank and property, misconduct, abuse of position, the variety of arrangements that powerful people make in rural counties far from London, where their power is relatively unchecked, and their confidence in their own impunity is, not unreasonably, fairly high. He had traveled to estates and manors and the houses of various officials across the south and west of England, and he had conducted investigations, and he had written reports, and the reports had in several cases resulted in consequences for the persons they concerned. He was not a man who took satisfaction in other people's downfall. He was a man who took satisfaction in accuracy, in the gap between what had been claimed and what had actually happened, in the work of finding that gap and documenting it clearly, so that people who had the power to act on it could do so. He had read Lady Catherine's letter twice. The first time he read it for information, the who and what and when of what she was describing, the missing candlesticks, and the housemaid, and the magistrate, and the land dispute, and the cousin. The second time he read it for something else, the quality of the writing, the specific way it was constructed, which told him things about the person who wrote it. He had read a great many letters from people making claims against figures of authority. Most of them had a quality of urgency, of emotion barely contained, of the writer's own distress pressing through the formal language they were trying to maintain. This letter was different. This was a letter written by a person who had been watching something for a long time and had decided that the moment had come to say something about it, and who had the specific calmness of someone who has already made their peace with the decision and is now simply executing it as clearly as possible. He trusted this letter more than most of the letters he received. His superior, Alderman Philip Waverley, had come to Gray's room that morning, with the letter in his hand, and the expression of a man who has read something he finds credible and concerning. He had placed it on Gray's desk, and had said, "This requires prompt action, Captain. A woman of title, in poor health, making a serious claim against her own husband, the land element, the magistrate, the servant." Gray had read it. He had asked 3 questions, received answers to 2 of them, and been told the third required his investigation to determine. He had thanked Alderman Waverley, received his formal written orders from the council's office, and spent 2 hours in preparation. He gathered the relevant documents, his commission, his royal writ, the forms required for formal inquiry under Crown authority, a sealed letter from the council to be presented upon his arrival at the estate. He arranged for a change of horses at the 2 posting inns on the Devonshire road. He packed what he needed, and no more. He left London at midday on a Thursday. The road to Devonshire was a good one in October. the surface firm and clear in the dry weather, the trees on either side of the route still holding some of their autumn color in the pale afternoon light. Gray rode at a steady pace, not rushing beyond what was useful, conserving the horse for the longer stretches. He stopped at the first posting inn near dusk, changed horses, ate bread and cold meat standing at the stable yard, and continued. He stopped at the second posting inn well past dark, slept for 4 hours on a narrow bed, in a room that smelled of tallow and old wood, and rose before 3 o'clock. He was in the lanes of Devonshire before dawn. He knew the area. He had been through this part of the county twice on previous assignments, enough to know the layout of the roads and the position of the larger estates relative to the main routes. He knew approximately where Havelock Estate sat, 2 miles from the market town, behind a stone wall that he could see, as he turned off the lane onto the estate road in the pre-dawn dark, running along the left side of the road in the faint gray-blue light that preceded the sun. He came to the gate as the sky was beginning, very slowly, and with great reluctance, to separate from the deep dark of the night into something that could eventually be called morning. The estate gates were iron, and large, and closed. A lantern burned on the gatepost, its light small in the remaining dark. A man was inside the gatehouse. This was Oliver Bates, the estate gatekeeper, who had been at the gate for 15 years, and whose opinion of unexpected visitors at unusual hours was shaped by those 15 years of experience, which had taught him that unexpected visitors at unusual hours were rarely welcome and frequently complicated. He came out of the gatehouse when he heard the horse on the road, carrying a second lantern, and he looked at the rider on the other side of the gate with the specific expression of a man preparing to tell someone that this was not the right time. Gray did not give him the opportunity. He said his name and his title. He produced the sealed commission from inside his coat and held it where Oliver Bates could read it through the iron bars of the gate. He said that he was here on the authority of the Privy Council and the King's office, and that he required immediate entry, and that any delay in granting this entry would be noted in the official record of his visit. Oliver Bates looked at the document. He looked at the seal. He looked at the man on the horse. He opened the gate. Gray rode through. He dismounted in the yard and handed the reins to Oliver, who had followed him through the gate with the expression of a man who has just done something he is not sure about and is hoping it turns out to be correct. Gray told him to wake the head steward and to do it quickly. Oliver went. Gray stood in the yard in the pre-dawn cold and looked at the house. It was large and gray and entirely dark except for 2 lit windows on the upper floor, and the kitchen chimney beginning to put out a thin thread of smoke from wherever the first kitchen work was starting. The estate smelled of damp stone and horses, and the particular autumn smell of fallen leaves going to earth in the corners of old walls. He waited with the patience of a man who has arrived where he intended to arrive, and has nothing left to do about the journey, and is simply here now. Sir Edmund Finch came out of the house in his nightclothes and a coat thrown over them, carrying a lamp, his face carrying everything that a person's face carries when they have been woken before dawn by news of a royal official at the gate. He stopped when he saw Gray, and for a brief moment, the face did something complicated, a rapid sequence of responses that settled, after a second or two, into something that Gray recognized. It was the face of a man who has been waiting for something to happen, and has not known whether it would happen, or whether he would have to live the rest of his life having watched something wrong and done nothing about it. It was the face of someone relieved. Gray showed him the royal writ and the sealed letter from the council. Sir Edmund read both. His hands, Gray noticed, were not quite steady on the documents. "I will need to speak with every member of the household," Gray said, "one at a time, in a private room, under Crown authority. No person is to be present during any other person's interview. The Duke is not to be informed of the content of any interview conducted before I have spoken with him. Is this clear?" "Yes," Sir Edmund said. His voice was very quiet. "Yes, Captain, it is clear." "Good. Then we will begin as soon as the household is up, and the Duke has been informed of my presence. I should like to speak with the Duke first. He will not be pleased." Gray looked at him. "I rarely am concerned with that," he said. They went inside. The house woke around them with the particular confusion of a building brought out of sleep by something unexpected. Gray could hear it in the sounds from different parts of the house as he waited in the front hall. The hurried footsteps of people told to get up without explanation. The murmur of voices behind doors. The particular tone of a household suddenly aware that something has changed. He waited with his coat still on, and his bag on the floor beside him, and his expression, the expression he used for waiting, which was simply no expression at all. Duke Aldrich Havelock came downstairs 40 minutes later. He was fully dressed, which was a choice that said something about him. He had been told a royal official was in his front hall, and had taken 40 minutes to dress rather than coming down in his nightclothes. He wanted to meet this on his own terms, in his own appearance, with the full weight of his position in order. Gray understood this about him before a word had been spoken. The Duke looked at Gray the way he looked at most things, with the calm assumption of a man who expects to be in charge of the room he walks into. Gray showed him the royal writ before the Duke could say anything. He gave him time to read it. He watched the Duke's face while he read it, not obtrusively, simply paying attention, because a person's face, while reading a document that concerns them, tells you a great deal that the subsequent conversation does not. The Duke's face while reading the writ was the face of a man recalculating. He was reading it, and at the same time running a fast and private inventory of his own situation, assessing what was known, what could be known, what the risks were. Gray had seen this face before. He had seen it in other men, in other houses, in other front halls before dawn. The specific quality of it told him several things at once about the nature of what had happened here. The Duke looked up from the document. "This is highly irregular," he said. "It is standard procedure," Gray said. "I will begin my interviews this morning. I should like a private room made available to me. I should also like to be shown, at the earliest opportunity, to the area where the relevant servant is currently being held." A pause, very brief. "She is in the root cellar," the Duke said. "She is still there," Gray said. It was not a question. "Yes." Gray held the Duke's gaze for a moment. "She will remain there until I have conducted my preliminary interviews and reviewed the circumstances," he said. "No one is to move her or alter her conditions before I have seen her. Is that understood?" The Duke's jaw was set. His eyes were flat and still. "As you say, Captain," he said. Gray nodded once. "Then let us proceed." The room Sir Edmund arranged for the interviews was the small parlor off the main hall, which had the advantage of having only one door and walls thick enough that a conversation conducted in a normal voice could not be heard from the corridor. Gray had his papers on the table, and his writ visible, and his manner, the manner he used in these rooms, direct, even, entirely free of the social assumptions of rank that normally governed interactions in houses like this one. He began with Sir Edmund. Sir Edmund sat across from him, with his hands folded on the table, and the expression of a man who has been carrying something for several days, and is approaching the point where setting it down becomes more possible than continuing to hold it. Gray let him settle. He did not rush. He had found in 6 years of this work that the first minutes of an interview were best used for listening to what a person was doing with their body and face and breathing before asking them anything about their words. He asked Sir Edmund to describe, in as much detail as he could, the sequence of events from the discovery of the missing silver through the present day. He asked him to tell it as completely as possible, and to include anything he had personally observed or concluded, even if he had not stated it to anyone at the time. Sir Edmund told him. He told him carefully and in sequence, and he did not leave anything out, not even the parts that reflected poorly on himself, which Gray had found was the most reliable sign that a person was telling the truth. The willingness to include the parts that made them look bad. Sir Edmund told him about the straight line, from the missing candlesticks, to Eleanor Marsh, about Arthur's account of the corridor, about the household meeting, about what he personally had believed from the beginning, and had not acted on. And his voice, when he came to this part of the account, was the voice of a person naming a thing they are not proud of. "You believed she did not take them," Gray said. "From the beginning," Sir Edmund said. "I told her I believed her." "And you did nothing further?" "No." Gray wrote something on his paper. "Tell me about Arthur Breck," he said. Sir Edmund told him about Arthur in the corridor, and what Arthur had actually been likely to do, which was what Gray had already suspected, but he wanted it on record from someone who knew the estate. He asked about the keys to the study. He asked about who had access to the guest wing, and when. He asked about Lord Weston's arrival, his movements, his demeanor. Sir Edmund answered everything directly, and without hesitation. And when the interview was finished, he sat for a moment looking at the table, and then he looked at Gray, and he said, "Is she going to be all right?" Gray said, Tell me where the cellar is." He went down to the cellar before the next interview. He took a lantern from the wall bracket in the corridor. He went down the stone steps and to the door and unlocked it with the key that Sir Edmund had given him, and he opened it. The first thing was the dark inside. How absolute it was. How total. The lantern light moved in and found the bench along the far wall, and on the bench a figure wrapped in a blanket who had gone very still at the sound of the door, and who looked at the light with eyes that needed a moment to adjust to it. He said, "Miss Marsh." Eleanor said, "Yes." Her voice was steady. He had not been certain it would be. "My name is Captain Roland Gray. I am here from the Privy Council in London, under the King's authority, to investigate the events that have led to your confinement. I need you to know that your situation is now under the formal attention of the Crown, and that nothing further will happen to you without my knowledge and authorization. Do you understand?" A silence. Then, "Yes," she said. "I understand. I will return to speak with you in detail once I have completed my initial interviews with other members of the household. For now, is there anything you require that is not here?" Another silence, shorter. "Light," she said, "if possible." He left the lantern with her. He went back upstairs and through the parlor door and sat down at the table and called for the next interview. Arthur Breck came in and sat down with the face of a man walking toward something he has been dreading. Gray let him sit for a moment and then asked him to describe the evening he had spent at his post in the corridor outside the Duke's study. Arthur began with the account he had given the Duke, the account of the unbroken watch, the no one entered, the confirmation that Eleanor Marsh had been the last person in the room. He said it with the particular wooden quality of a person reciting something they have said before and know to be untrue. Gray let him finish. Then he said, "Thank you. Now tell me what actually happened." Arthur looked at him. "I know you did not stay at that post all night," Gray said, in the same even tone he used for everything. "I know this because no one stays at a corridor post for an entire night without reason to do so beyond routine assignment, and because Sir Edmund has told me something about your habits, and because the account you just gave me has the quality of something rehearsed, rather than remembered. So tell me what actually happened." Arthur was quiet for 30 seconds. They were a very long 30 seconds. Then he told the truth. He had left the post before 9 o'clock. He had gone down to the kitchen for bread, and had stayed longer than intended, talking with Clara, and had come back to the corridor perhaps an hour later. He did not know, during the time he was away, who had or had not entered the study. He had told the Duke what the Duke asked him to tell him, because he was afraid to do anything else. Gray wrote it down. He had Arthur sign the account. Arthur signed it with his hands shaking slightly, and then went out of the room, and did not look back. The interviews continued through the morning. Clara Dent came and told him what she knew and what she had felt, and her honesty was complete, and her relief at being asked was visible and genuine. Henry Rowe came and told him what he had observed with the specific economy of a man who deals in practical facts and has no patience for anything else. William Dobbs, the solicitor, came and told him about the documents, under the particular pressure that royal authority brought to bear on men who had signed things they were uncomfortable defending, and his account of the timing of the documents was revealing in itself. He had brought them to the estate 2 days before Magistrate Harlow had arrived to confirm the finding, which meant they had been prepared before the finding, which meant the finding had been arranged before it was conducted. He sat across from Gray with the expression of a man who has been calculating this moment since the previous afternoon, and has not found a calculation that he likes. Gray put the documents in front of him and asked him to explain the timeline, and Harlow looked at the documents and looked at Gray, and then did something that surprised Gray slightly, which was that he did not try. He did not construct an alternative account. He did not insist on the correctness of his findings. He sat for a moment, and then he said, "What do you want me to tell you?" "The truth," Gray said. Harlow told it. All of it. The history of his relationship with the Duke, the favors, the obligations, the documents signed over 22 years that had built the structure of his compliance, the meeting with the Duke 3 days ago, the documents already prepared before he arrived, the silver in the wardrobe that had the specific smell of the stable, and the specific wrapping of someone who knew how to bundle things for transport, and had not been trying to hide something, but had been trying to place something. Lord Weston's face when he looked at the silver, the face of a man who had no idea what he was looking at, or how it had come to be there. He told all of it, and when he finished, he sat looking at the table and he said, "I am 60 years old, and I have spent 22 of those years in a room I built myself out of things I agreed to do, and I can see now that it was never going to end any other way than this." Gray said, "Sign the account." Harlow signed it. Gray spent half an hour with the signed accounts, reading them in order, building the picture from the pieces each person had provided. Then he called for Peter Aldgate. Peter Aldgate had never been inside this part of the house before. The servants' world and the family world of Havelock Estate overlapped in certain practical places, the kitchens and the corridors and the back passages, but a 12-year-old stable boy did not normally find himself in the front parlor off the main hall, sitting in a cushioned chair across a table from a man he had never seen before who wore no insignia he could recognize, but carried himself with the authority of someone whose authority did not need insignia to make itself felt. Peter sat on the edge of the chair with his hands on his knees, and his back very straight, and his expression, the expression of a person who is frightened, but has decided to be here anyway. Henry Rowe had brought him. Henry had come to the stable an hour ago, and crouched down to Peter's eye level, which Henry rarely did, and had told him that there was a man from London who wanted to speak with him, an official man, with papers from the king's own office, and that Peter did not have to be afraid of this man, and that this man was on the right side of things. Henry had said this last part with the particular directness of a person wanting to make sure they are understood, on the right side of things. Peter had understood. He had washed his face and combed his hair, because Henry had suggested it, and because it was the kind of thing you did when you were about to meet someone important. He had walked across the yard, and through the back door, and along the corridor, and into the parlor. Captain Gray looked at him across the table. He looked at him the way he had looked at all of them, without judgment and without particular warmth, with the steady attention of a person who is going to listen to everything you say, and write it down, and take it completely seriously, and who has no interest in telling you what you should have done differently, or making you feel worse about any of it than you already do. "Peter Aldgate," Gray said, 12 years old, stable hand at Havelock Estate. "Yes, sir." "I want you to understand something before we begin," Gray said. "I am here under the authority of the King's Privy Council. What that means, in practical terms, is that this conversation is protected by the Crown. Anything you tell me in this room is told directly to the Crown's authority, not to the Duke or to anyone on this estate. You are under the Crown's protection while you are in this room. Do you understand?" Peter said, "Yes, sir." He understood what it meant. He had understood what it meant the moment Henry said the words "on the right side of things." He had understood it with the bone-deep relief of a person who has been carrying something alone in the cold for a very long time, and has been told, finally, that someone has come to help carry it. He was still afraid. He was not going to stop being afraid just because someone said the right words, but the fear was different now. It had a shape and a limit. It did not fill everything the way it had filled everything for the past several days. Gray said, "Tell me what you saw." Peter told him. He started at the beginning, at the sick foal and not sleeping, and getting up at midnight to check on her. He told it in the simple, clear way he had been telling things his whole short life, without embellishment or hesitation, the way people tell things when they are telling the truth, and not trying to make it into something more than it is. He told Gray about crossing the yard and climbing onto the mounting block and looking through the corner of the study window. He described what he had seen, the Duke at the left side of the desk, the 2 silver candlesticks in his hands, the cloth from the stables, the thick dark kind used for wrapping harness parts and tools, which Peter could identify with precision because he handled that cloth regularly and knew its particular look and texture. The careful wrapping. The Duke going to the study door and looking out before leaving. He described the direction the Duke had taken, which was toward the back of the house, toward the passage that led to the guest wing. He had not followed. He had stood in the yard until the study lamp had been the only light left, and then he had gone back to the stable. He described the morning after, hearing about Eleanor, going still. Gray had not interrupted once. He let Peter finish, and then he sat quietly for a moment, looking at his notes, and then he said, "The cloth that the Duke used, you said it was the kind used in the stable?" "Yes, sir. Heavy, dark cotton. We use it for bundling harness parts. We have a supply of it in the tack room. Would you be able to identify such a cloth if you saw it again?" "Yes, sir." "Good." Gray stood. "I want you to come with me." They went together through the house to the guest wing. Gray had the key to Lord Weston's former room from Sir Edmund. Lord Weston himself was in the sitting room at the end of the corridor, where he had been since the morning, permitted to neither leave nor receive visitors while the investigation was in progress. Gray unlocked the room and opened the wardrobe. The cloth-wrapped bundle was where it had been when Harlow examined it, sitting on the bottom shelf of the wardrobe, wrapped and tied. Gray stood back. He let Peter look at it from the doorway without entering the room. Peter looked at the cloth for 10 seconds. Then he said, "That is from our stable. That is the same cloth." Gray wrote this down. He unwrapped the bundle himself, carefully, wearing gloves, and laid the 2 silver candlesticks on the floor of the room and looked at them. They were exactly what Lady Catherine's letter had described. A pair, matching, ornate at the base. The kind of silver candlesticks that sit on a man's desk for 15 years as an emblem of his taste and his relationships and his standing. They were in the tack-room cloth, like 2 things placed there specifically to be found, not like 2 things hidden by a person trying to conceal a theft. He brought the Duke in at 4 o'clock. He had waited for 4 o'clock deliberately. He had spent the intervening time organizing his documentation, reviewing the signed accounts, verifying what he had and what it meant. He had also sent a message to the guest wing, via Sir Edmund, informing Lord Weston of the general direction of the investigation, which was not standard practice, but which Gray had judged appropriate, given that Lord Weston had been sitting in a room all day, under a formal finding that was about to be overturned. Duke Aldrich came into the parlor with the manner he had maintained all morning, controlled, upright, carrying the full weight of his position in his bearing, as if the position could protect him from anything the room might contain. He sat down across from Gray, with the deliberate calm of a man who has decided that calm is his best posture and is going to maintain it, regardless of what comes at him. Gray laid the signed accounts on the table. He laid them in order: Sir Edmund's, Arthur's, Clara's, Henry's, Harlow's. Last of all, he laid a single sheet that contained Peter Aldgate's testimony, signed by Gray himself as the official record of a Crown interview with a minor witness. The Duke looked at the papers. He did not touch them. Gray told him, in a level and entirely uninflected voice, what the papers said. He told him about Arthur's real account of the corridor, and about the solicitor's timeline for the documents, and about Harlow's full confession, and about Peter Aldgate, and the window, and the midnight walk across the yard, and the cloth from the tack room. He told him all of it, and then he put the cloth-wrapped bundle on the table, and looked at the Duke and said, "This cloth has been identified by your stable hand as material from your own stable. The silver was found in the guest room of Lord Weston Crane, where it was placed by your own action, on the night of the 12th of October. These are not allegations, these are documented facts, attested by multiple witnesses, confirmed by a confession from the magistrate you engaged to process a fraudulent legal finding." The Duke looked at the bundle. He looked at it for a long time. Something moved across his face in that silence. It was not remorse. Gray had seen remorse, and knew its face, and this was not it. It was something older, and colder, and more private. The specific expression of a man who has run a calculation all the way to its end, and found that the result is not what he planned. Not grief, not shame, simply the arithmetic of a thing that has not come out correctly. He said, "I wish to speak with my solicitor." "You may do so after I have concluded this interview," Gray said. "For now, I have questions, and you will answer them." The Duke answered them. He answered them in the careful, minimal way of a man who knows his situation and is not going to make it worse by saying more than is required. He confirmed what needed to be confirmed. He did not volunteer. He was consistent in his manner throughout, which was the manner of a man who has never once in his life believed himself to be fundamentally wrong about anything, and is not about to start now. It was the most telling thing about him, that even here, in the parlor, with the signed accounts on the table, and the stable cloth on top of them, and the testimony of a 12-year-old boy against him, his manner was the manner of inconvenience rather than guilt. He was not sorry. He was simply caught, which is a different thing entirely. Gray ended the interview at 5:30. He had what he needed. He had more than he needed, because 6 witnesses had given him the same truth, from 6 different angles, and the angles were consistent, and the truth they enclosed was complete and clear and amply documented. He went to find Sir Edmund and told him that Duke Aldrich Havelock was formally detained, pending a full hearing before the King's Bench, on charges to be specified in the written report that Grey would submit to the Privy Council within the week. He told Sir Edmund that the documents relating to Lord Weston Crane were to be considered suspended, pending legal review, and that Lord Weston should be so informed. He told him that William Dobbs was not to leave the estate until Grey had received confirmation from the council that his cooperation with the investigation was noted, and his own position clarified. Then he said, "Bring me the key to the cellar." He went down to the cellar. The lantern he had left that morning was still burning. Eleanor Marsh was sitting on the bench with the blanket around her, and the lantern on the floor beside her, and she was awake, which she had been, he suspected, for most of the day. She looked at him when he opened the door. In the lantern light, her face was the face of a person who has been in a difficult place for a long time, and who has maintained themselves in it through the specific and exhausting practice of keeping their mind clear, when everything around them is trying to make it not. He said, "Miss Marsh, I am ready to speak with you now. I have completed my investigation. Before I do, I want to tell you the following. You are innocent of every charge made against you in this house. This has been established beyond any reasonable doubt by the testimony of multiple witnesses and the confession of the magistrate who conducted the legal proceedings against you. You will be formally exonerated in a proceeding I will conduct tomorrow morning. Tonight you will be moved from this room to appropriate quarters in the house. You will not be returned to this cellar." Eleanor looked at him. The lantern light moved between them in the small space. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "The candlesticks," she said. "What were they for? What was all of this actually about?" Grey told her, briefly and simply. The land dispute, the cousin, the scheme to use the silver, and the magistrate to produce a fraudulent legal finding that would cost Lord Weston his property. She was the pretext, the person who could plausibly be blamed for the silver's disappearance, removing it from the study, in a way that could then be used as the narrative foundation for claiming it had been stolen and planted. Then she nodded once, slowly, the way a person nods when they receive information that makes the shape of something they already suspected finally clear. "I did not know what the why was," she said. "I knew there was one, but I could not get to it from where I was." "No," Grey said, "you could not." She looked at him for a moment more. Then she said, "Who wrote to you?" He paused. This was not normally information he shared, but he looked at the face in front of him, the 19-year-old face that had sat in this dark cellar for 8 days and held itself together, and he said, "Lady Catherine Havelock." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Something moved across her face that was not easy to name. "I did not know she knew," she said. "She watched from her window," Grey said. Eleanor looked down at her hands, which were holding the piece of dried lavender that had been in her pocket since the beginning. "Please make sure she knows it worked," she said. The morning after Captain Grey's arrival was different from the mornings that had preceded it. The difference was in the quality of the air in the house, in the way people moved through the corridors and spoke to each other in the kitchens, in the specific atmosphere of a large building that has been living under a particular kind of pressure for more than a week, and that pressure has, overnight, changed its nature. It had not lifted entirely. There was still too much unresolved, too much to be sorted through and determined and officially settled, but the quality of it had changed. The direction of it had changed. What had been bearing down on a specific person in a specific cellar was now bearing down on something else, and the household felt this, without being able to articulate it precisely, the way animals feel a change in the weather before it is technically visible. Eleanor had been moved the previous evening, as Grey had promised, to a room in the servants' quarters that had a real bed and a window and a candle and no locked door. Bessie had been there when she arrived, which she suspected was not accidental, and Bessie had sat with her through the evening and had not said anything much, which was exactly right, because there was not much to say yet, and Eleanor was too tired for the kind of conversation that would have been appropriate to the occasion. She had slept, properly, for the first time in 8 days, in a bed with a blanket and a pillow, and the sleep had been the kind of sleep that a body goes into fully and completely, when it has been running on something finer and more effortful than sleep, for a long time, and has finally been given permission to stop. She woke before dawn, old habit, She lay in the actual dark of a normal dark room, not the absolute dark of the cellar, but the ordinary dark of a room, with a window that showed the gray shape of the pre-dawn sky, and she listened to the house around her and thought, very quietly and carefully, about what was going to happen today. Gray had told her the night before, there would be a formal proceeding in the morning, in the main courtyard of the estate, where the relevant finding would be read aloud. He had explained what the document would say, and what it would mean. He had explained that she would receive a sealed letter from the Privy Council, confirming her formal exoneration, and her right to seek future employment, without the shadow of any charge against her name. He had explained the restitution, which was a formal payment from the estate, representing recognition that she had suffered a substantial wrong, and that this payment was not optional under Crown authority. She had listened to all of this carefully, and she had thanked him carefully, and then she had gone to bed and slept. Now she lay in the pre-dawn gray, and she thought, today. She thought about the courtyard, where the proceeding would be held. She thought about standing in that courtyard again, in the cold morning air. She thought about the last time she had stood there, and about what had happened, and she held both things simultaneously, the last time and this time, and she found that she could hold them both, without one of them destroying the other, which was something she would not have been certain she could do. She got up. She washed her face. She dressed. Bessie came and helped her with her hair, and neither of them spoke while this was happening, which was the right kind of silence, the kind that has something warm in it. At 8:30, Sir Edmund came to the room and told her that Captain Grey was ready. The household was assembled in the courtyard, as they had been a week ago. The same people in roughly the same places, except that everything was different, the direction different, the weight of what was happening different, the particular quality of everyone's face and bearing different. Clara Dent was still standing with her arms around herself, but her face now had a different expression on it. Henry Rowe was standing with his arms uncrossed and his chin up, and he looked directly at Eleanor when she came through the back door, which was the first time in the whole of this terrible week that he had been able to do that, and his look said everything that his silence had been containing. Arthur Breck was there. He stood near the back. He did not look at Eleanor, but he had come, which was its own statement. Peter Aldgate was near the stable gate. He was not hiding this time. He was standing in the open, just inside the yard, and when Eleanor looked at him, he looked back at her directly, with the face of a 12-year-old who has done the most difficult thing of his life, and is still standing on the other side of it, and Eleanor gave him a small, steady nod, and his shoulders came down slightly from where they had been, which was very high. Lord Weston Crane was there too, which had not been announced but which made sense. He was part of this. He had been a target of this, and his presence here was its own recognition of that. He stood to one side in his traveling coat, a man who had been unable to defend himself against something he did not do, who had watched a Crown official arrive and cut through the thing that had been built around him like a surgeon, remove something that should not be there. Captain Grey stood at the far end of the courtyard with his documents in his hand. He did not dress the moment with ceremony. He was not a theatrical person. He held the document and he read it, in his clear and level voice, in the cold October morning air, with everyone listening. He read Eleanor's full name. He read the charges that had been made against her, and he read them out completely, because the reversal of a thing must be as public as the thing itself, or it means nothing. He read the investigation findings, in summary, citing the number of witnesses and the nature of the evidence. He read the formal conclusion, that Eleanor Marsh was innocent of every charge brought against her, that the charges had been false in their origin and fraudulent in their execution, that the legal proceeding that had confirmed them had been conducted corruptly and was now void, and that no record of any charge against her name would stand. He read this in the courtyard, in the same place where the punishment had been carried out, in the same morning air, with the same light coming up over the eastern wall. Eleanor stood very straight and listened to every word. She did not cry. She had decided she was not going to cry in the courtyard, not because crying was wrong or weak, but because she had made a decision about who she was going to be in this moment, and that person was standing straight and listening clearly, and receiving what was being given to her, with the full dignity of someone who knew all along that it was the truth. When Grey finished reading, he folded the document and gave her a sealed envelope. He said, quietly enough that it was between the two of them, "The second document inside is the restitution letter. The amount is noted in the letter. It will be available to you from the estate accounts on your instruction." She took the envelope. She held it. "One more thing. Gray said, at the same quiet register. Lady Catherine asked me to give you a message this morning. She asked me to tell you that she was glad she wrote the letter. She said to tell you that watching you in the courtyard on that morning was the thing that finally made her do it, and she was glad. Eleanor looked at him. Please tell her, she began. I told her this morning what happened yesterday, Gray said. She knows. Eleanor nodded. She held the envelope, and she breathed the cold October morning air, and she looked at the eastern wall, where the light was still coming up, and she thought about Lady Catherine in her room above, watching, and she thought about Margaret, riding to the village with a letter in her coat, and about a 12-year-old boy at a window in the middle of the night, and about Bessie bringing food every evening in the dark, and about Clara's lavender, and old Ned's cake, and Henry Rowe leaving the gate unlocked, and she thought that the truth, when it cannot defend itself on its own, sometimes needs a great many people to carry it, and that the carrying of it is its own kind of courage, and that she was standing in the morning light because a collection of people had done what they could with what they had available to them, and that this mattered, and that she would not forget it. Duke Aldrich Havelock was formally arrested under Crown authority that same morning, not in the courtyard but in the house, in the presence of Gray and Sir Edmund and 2 men Gray had brought with him for this purpose. He was escorted from the estate under guard, to be held pending his appearance before the King's Bench in London. He left through the front door of his estate in the cold October morning, without looking at the yard or the servants or the courtyard or any of it, looking straight ahead with the same controlled face he had worn in the parlor the day before, the face of a man who has still not arrived at remorse, because the road to remorse is paved with the ability to genuinely see other people as people, and this was a road he had never learned to travel. Lord Weston's documents were formally voided that afternoon. Gray wrote the orders himself and had them witnessed and sealed. Lord Weston's land was his. Whatever correspondence was necessary between his solicitors and the Crown's office would follow in due course, but the fraudulent proceedings against him were legally null, and he was told this clearly and directly, and the relief on his face when he heard it was the face of a man who has been under water and has just broken the surface. William Dobbs was permitted to leave the estate after providing a full account of his involvement, with the note in the council's official record that his cooperation had been complete. Magistrate Harlow's signed confession was forwarded to the council with Gray's full report. What happened to Harlow after that would be a matter for the formal process, but his account was on the record, and the record was official, and the things on official records tend not to go away. 3 days later, a message came from Margaret Yates to Bessie, by way of the kitchen stairs, that Lady Catherine had been told everything, and had received the news with her eyes closed, and a very small and very specific smile, the smile of a person whose last significant act has turned out to mean something. 4 days after the courtyard, Lady Catherine Havelock died in her room, in the east wing, in the morning, with Margaret beside her, and the old oak tree, outside the window, in its last autumn color, the amber going to brown at the tips, the leaves beginning their long inevitable descent. She died the way she had conducted herself in the last months of her life, quietly and with intention, and having done the things she had decided to do. Margaret stayed with her until the doctor came, and then she went to the kitchen and sat at the table and put her hands flat on the wood and was still for a long time. Eleanor spent 3 more days at the estate after the courtyard proceeding, not because she had to, but because she had things to do. She said goodbye properly to everyone who had mattered. She sat with Bessie for a long time on the last evening, and they talked about the practical and impractical things, where Eleanor was going, what she would do, the reference that Gray had ensured she had from the council's office, the restitution money that was now in her possession, and that opened certain possibilities that had not existed before. Bessie cried, which she had earned the right to do, and Eleanor held her and told her that the crying was allowed, and that she was going to be all right, and that Eleanor was going to be all right, and that both of these things were true. She said goodbye to Peter Aldgate on the morning she left. He was in the stable, as he always was in the morning, doing the first feed, and he turned around when he heard her come in, and stood very still for a moment, with the feed bucket in his hands, and the slightly unfinished expression of a 12-year-old who is not quite sure of the social mechanism for what is happening. She said, "You were very brave." He said, "I should have said something sooner." "Yes," she said, "but you said it. That is what matters." He nodded. He looked at the feed bucket, then he looked back at her and said, "Are you going to be all right?" She smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that uses all of the face. "Yes," she said, "I am going to be more than all right." She walked out through the stable and across the yard and through the estate gate, which Oliver Bates held open for her without being asked, standing to one side with his hat off, because he was an old-fashioned man, and this seemed to him the right gesture for the moment. The road outside the gate was the same road it always was. The October air was cold and dry and clear, with the smell of leaves and the particular brightness of an autumn morning when the sun comes through on a day that has decided to be good. She had her bag. She had her envelope. She had her reference. She had everything that was genuinely hers. She stood at the gate for a moment and looked at the road going away through the trees in both directions, the road that went back toward the village and the road that went on toward everything else. She had been 19 years old when she walked through that gate the first time. She was still 19. She was also, in every way that mattered more than the number, entirely different. She chose the road that went on. She walked out into the October morning with her back straight and her hands steady, and her face turned toward the light that was still coming up in the east, still arriving, still new, the same kind of dawn that had brought the worst thing that had ever happened to her, and had later brought the man who had helped put it right. And it occurred to her that this was what dawns were. Not promises, not guarantees, just the arrival of new light on whatever was already there, and what you did in that light was entirely up to you. She walked. The gate closed behind her. The road went on ahead.